That's the Tremont Temple Baptist Church on downtown Forsyth Street. It and other black churches like the First Baptist just down the street hosted the birth of the civil rights movement in Macon 30 years ago. Even today, if you listen closely, you can imagine you can still hear one of those spirited rallies which went on inside its walls in the early 60s. Today, we're going to travel back once again to the early 1960s in Macon for a look at our troubled years and the birth of the civil rights movement.
On Cherry Street, freedom. On Cherry Street, freedom. On Cherry Street, freedom. Freedom, freedom. At Westgate, freedom. At Westgate, freedom. At Westgate.
As early as 1961, Macon's black community began its assault on segregated bus seating. On February the 25th of that year, 12 black teenagers got on 4 downtown buses and sat down right up in front. Now in 1961, if you were black, you sat in the rear of the bus. The front was reserved for white people. When the young people refused to move, they were tossed in jail for violating Georgia's segregated bus seating law. Things rocked along for a year with nothing much being done. Then the Evangelical Ministers Alliance decided it was time to bring the issue to a head. On the afternoon of Friday, February the 9th, 1962, 4 black ministers got on a city bus up near the Tremont Temple Church and sat down in the front. One of them was the Reverend Van J. Malone.
And there was a young driver, a young fella. He didn't pay us attention at all. And we went on downtown and around. He still didn't bother us. We were sitting in the front of the bus. We got out as far as Oglethorpe and Broadway. Said, let's get off this bus and get on another. This man's not going to do anything to us. We got out and waited till the bus coming back to town and got on there, and there was a gray-haired driver. And when we sat down in the front, he became disturbed, said, go back to the back. We refused. He made about 3 efforts to persuade us to back, we wouldn't. Then he called the police. Police came, he says, what you got here? He says, a sit-in. He called it. He got on there. Well, I think his rule of order was that he too was to invite us to come back. We refused, said, we're quite comfortable here. He said, well, come go with me then. We got off, the 4 of us. And Pascal asked him, said, are we to consider ourselves under arrest? He said, no, I want you to go downtown, answer some questions. We got in the car, carried us down there, and proceeded to process us, making pictures and mugging them, what they call them, right? And fingerprinting.
The stage was set and the confrontation was on. The next day, the Reverend E.B. Pascal, pastor of Tremont Temple, and one of the 4 arrested on the bus, announced a full-blown boycott of Bibb Transit Company buses.
4 ministers rode up front on a bus and were arrested. We immediately notified the general public that unless we could have a conference with officials to resolve the matter, we would refrain from paying to be segregated on the buses. We were informed by the attorney for the Bibb Transit Company on the afternoon of Saturday, February the 9th, that he was ready for a conference on that night. He informed us that he had a dinner party for that night. We then asked for a conference for the next day, which was Sunday. He stated that he would try to see us on Monday. We informed him that would be too late, as we had already asked Negroes to refrain from paying to be segregated. His answer was, let her rip.
With respect to the seating of passengers on Bibb Transit Company buses, the law of Georgia provides all conductors of streetcars and buses shall assign all passengers to seat on the cars under that charge, so as to separate the white and colored races as much as practicable. Certain colored leaders now desire to defy the courts, take the law in their own hands, and force economic pressure by boycott on Bibb Transit Company, so that Bibb Transit Company will ignore and violate the very law that at this junction has been held valid in their own test case. If in the test case the courts hold the law invalid, that will be the end of it. The sensible way, the constitutional way, the American way, and the Christian way to determine this controversy is in the courts. No one will benefit from a boycott.
When the people found out we were in jail, they were ready to go. And then from then on, the bus boycott moved up, and we moved our transfer point out there in front of the railway station.
You used carpools extensively, didn't you?
Extensively, carpools, that's right. 234 cars, and people rode those days who never did even ride the buses. We carried people from the house to the jobs, from the grocery store to the homes, and didn't charge them a penny.
And the police were harassing us, come up and follow us, and as soon as we stopped at a meter, he put a ticket while you coming out of your car. And we had a stack of tickets, over $707 the first day, and tickets. And we'd say, well, you won't give me a chance to get to the meeting. He said, you should have had it in there before you got here. We had day after day, nightly mass meetings for no other purpose than to raise money to finance these cars. For 2 days, we couldn't find Mayor Wilson, the first 2 days. They claimed he was out of town, but we couldn't. I guess he's figuring out how he was going to approach the thing.
Things I remember, I was in Washington for some reason that I can't recall now, and had to come back because of that, and I called a meeting at City Hall on the next Saturday morning. It's been going on for a week, I guess. We met all Saturday morning and finally worked out an arrangement where it was, these were face-saving kind of things at that point. I remember starting the meeting by saying, hey, you know, both of you guys are wrong. Number one, the transit company ought to go ahead and integrate and forget about this thing. And number two, the blacks ought to go into court rather than causing all this tension. But finally they agreed that Bill Randall did, they would file a suit, and Wallace Miller agreed that they wouldn't defend it.
We got Donald Hollowell down here from Atlanta, and he got every time they'd do something, he'd shoot it into the federal court. Judge Booth was up there.
What incident brought it about? Could you tell us that? Well, I don't know that there is any one incident. It appears that there have been a series of incidents, the latest one being on yesterday when the two plaintiffs got on a bus and were asked to move to the rear, and rather than to move, they dismounted from the bus.
On March the 1st, 1962, Federal Judge W.A. Boodle ordered an end to segregated seating on Macon's buses. Less than 8 months later, one of the men who led the fight to bring it about was dead. Did Reverend Paschal know while he was involved in all of the boycott activities and so forth that he was terminally ill, that he was going to die?
Yeah, I think he did. I think he did. He says, I'm not doing this. Oftentimes he said, this is not for me. It's for you and others, the young people that's coming on. But repeatedly he would say that.
And the ballpark freedom.
During the fall of 1962, Mercer University officials were doing a lot of soul searching over whether or not to drop racial barriers at the all-white Baptist school. On a motion by President Rufus Harris, a special committee headed by the Reverend Walter Moore, pastor of Vineville Baptist Church, was appointed to study the matter. But some student organizations didn't take kindly to the idea. While U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals Justice Griffin Bell was addressing that year's annual Law Day ceremony, the students cranked out a resolution expressing their displeasure.
This is the campus of Mercer University, where today the 15th annual observance of Law Day was held. And one of the main highlights of the day was a passing of a resolution by the law chapter of the Alumni Association of Mercer. That resolution reading, be it resolved, we do hereby register our objection to the integration of the school's educational facilities, it being our feeling that to so act would be contrary to the best interest of the university and student body. We might point out the vote for that resolution to be passed was 27 for, 17 against, 44 votes out of a total of some 100 who were present, some leaving the room preferring not to vote, others just abstaining from voting.
The student protest didn't carry much weight, however, for on April the 18th, 1963, Mercer's trustees adopted a recommendation that they consider all applicants for admission, quote, without regard to race, color of skin, creed, or origin. During the summer of 1960, Bibb Superior Court Judge Oscar L. Long ordered the grand jury to investigate allegations of black bloc voting in the county. Judge Long, who at the time was the undisputed political power in the county, told the jury that there had been accusations that candidates had paid large sums to black leaders to win the black vote.
Now, Judge Long, and when he was solicitor of the city court at that time, the state court now, solicited our help from the same organization he charged the grand jury against. And now, since he's the judge and they seem to be going in the other direction towards some candidates that he didn't want, then he made this charge to the jury.
It is true that there was what could be described as block voting during that time, but it was at a time when things were really polarized. I mean, the whites were here and the Negroes were here, and it's understandable that they would block. They don't do it anymore to any great degree that you have. Then, too, I think you had one or two just very strong leaders, Bill Randall being one of them, and T.B. Hooper another. But certainly the idea that, as far as I was concerned, I feel confident, likewise with Sheriff Wood, the idea that we were buying votes just wasn't anything to it.
They didn't indict, but in the presentments, they really brought it down and said that we were practicing block voting and it's wrong and it's against the law and all that kind of thing, which didn't amount to a hill of beans because there was no law against it. And I said that I made issue a statement that if I had done anything against law, indict me, give me a chance to appear in court to defend myself. Nobody did.
I thought it was racism, and I guess the reason Jim Wood was held in contempt of court for what he said is that he was just a little bit rougher in his language than I was. Both of us were very critical of the judge and the grand jury, and I can say to you, when he was held in contempt, I thought it would just be a short time that I would be there with him. But you remember his case went to the United States Supreme Court, and eventually he was vindicated.
The decision of the Supreme Court of the United States is a proper ending for our little high noon drama here in Bibb County. The public by now should realize that those who scream about Negro block voting are actually out to steal white votes. The cry of Negro block voting is raised not to deplore block voting, but rather to create a white block vote which can be controlled by demagogues playing on racial fears. Americans who live in the South have an unprecedented opportunity to move into the mainstream of American life. All mankind is seeking that government and social order under which men of all faiths and all races can live, if not as brothers, at least as equals who share in a universal freedom and justice.
He was far ahead of his time, and but he took a brave step, and he paid for it. He paid for it. It broke him politically at that time because the sentiment was against him. Anybody was standing for rights for black people the way he did in public, it just broke him.
The Supreme Court's action in Jim Wood's case was not the only government involvement in voting matters in Bibb County in 1962. Prior to that year, blacks and whites voted at separate locations in each precinct. On May the 16th, the Justice Department filed suit to stop the county's segregated voting practices. Democratic Executive Committee Chairman Lawton Miller said that there was no way the polls could be desegregated in time for the September the 12th primary.
The filing today by the United States Department of Justice of suit against the Bibb County Democratic Executive Committee to force integration of the white and Negro races at the polls in the September 12th primary comes as no surprise. The filing of this action against the committee is but further proof of the determination of the federal government to destroy every vestige of local self-government. This action is completely political in nature, designed by the federal government in Washington to court the favor and to win the votes of northern minorities in the November congressional elections.
On June 1st, Judge W.A. Boodle ordered 6 of Bibb County's 13 voting places desegregated immediately, but he allowed election officials another year to eliminate the dual polls in the 7 other precincts. In 1962, a local group calling themselves the White Citizens Council for the Betterment of America organized a local version of Freedom Rides North. Under the program, they shipped area blacks who couldn't find a job locally to a northern state. Their first reverse Freedom Rider was 22-year-old Tom Barnes of Twiggs County. He was given $5 spending money and a train ticket to Cleveland, Ohio.
Well, we knew that was an unsuccessful way to retaliate, and it backfired on them because people they picked up there were people who need to be somewhere on welfare, and they sent them off up there, and then they had no way to get back, and they didn't know what to do out of that strange environment, in a strange environment, and that didn't last long.
Roy Wilkins was the national president of the NAACP in 1962. On October the 27th, he addressed the annual convention of the state organization in Macon. Bill Randall, who's on the left in this 1962 film, was among those greeting him at the airport. I sort of get the idea of the local organization, not only the NAACP, but the Citizens Coordinating Committee too, pretty well tried to follow the beliefs of both Martin Luther King Jr. and Roy Wilkins in the NAACP at that time, and that was strictly a nonviolence attitude towards the state.
That's correct. Absolutely. We required that. And those persons who didn't agree to that, we wouldn't let them participate in our demonstrations at all. If you say you couldn't go out there and take an egg thrown in your face or rock hit you or something like that, without retaliating, we wouldn't take you.
In the spring of 1963, blacks began an effort to desegregate Macon's public parks. The city had dropped all laws requiring segregation in the parks, and for a few days, everything went peacefully.
So we had a tentative agreement that nobody would go to the parks in the next several days. And that morning, as I came into my office on Cotton Avenue, I had a telephone call that about 30 black kids were out in the park, and 3 old people, 2 women, and 1 man, adults, were out there with them. They hadn't got the message about don't go to the park. And having surrounded them about 1,200, were anywhere from 600 or 700, to estimate run to 1,200 or 1,300, whites from down in the Mill Village down around Oglethorpe down there, had them surrounded, threatening them. It looked dangerous. The policemen were on the perimeter of the park, but they didn't go in.
I remember one of the black leaders at the time, Lewis Wynn, was stabbed in the Tatthall Square Park. He, of course, survived, but a great deal of racial tension. We were getting national news attention at the park.
And we got out there, and some officers I knew were there to get the gate and advised me not to go in as a trap. But we went in anyway, sent the kids out of the gate going to Mercer, and we stayed there until they got out, and then we began to bring the 3 old people out, and just as we started out, the rock started. We finally got into Tom's car, and that motor wouldn't crank.
Oh, wow.
It was just over and over and over again, and the bricks began to rain on the cars, and I reached at the glove compartment if something was in it, and nothing was in it, but it stopped them for momentarily, and finally it chugged off, and we pulled away.
The trouble was coming not from the kids, and we found long ago that the children integrate in a hurry. It was the grown-ups that were causing all the problems.
At that point, he acted with, after then, with more decisiveness and in informing the police department that he was chief, and if they couldn't do it, then he'd have to get somebody who would.
And I remember we had a conference in my office in City Hall one morning, what are we going to do? And I'm still amused by it. The director of the Parks Department said he thought we ought to close the park.
We do not intend to stand by and watch our playgrounds turned into battlegrounds. I'm deeply disappointed by the incidents of violence which occurred on Tatthall Square Park late Tuesday afternoon. Violence is not the solution to this or any other problem. I want to make it abundantly clear that the city will carry out its responsibility to maintain peace and good order, even if it requires exercising the power vested in me by City Council to close the parks and playgrounds. The Macon Police Department has been instructed to make cases against anyone attempting to provoke a breach of the peace. It would be a terrible reflection on our city if it becomes necessary to deny our children use of the playgrounds in order to keep the peace. I sincerely hope that such a drastic move will not become necessary. I'm confident that the vast majority of Macon citizens want to obey the law and to keep a peaceful community. I call on all Maconites to use restraint and reason. Stay away from the playgrounds unless they are there for recreational purposes. Let's not mar the good name of our city with racial strife and tensions.
The idea was that people are going to think twice before they lose their rights to use the parks. That would have been a very difficult thing to enforce, of course. It was more in the way of threat than it was any real intent.
He ordered them to quit harassing the mass meeting. They were going to the mass meeting, ticketing every car that was outside, making mass arrests on traffic charges, trying to drain our treasury, you know, or to stop the mass meetings, and threatening to come in and tear down the microphones, teaming up with the Klan members. And he ordered that to stop. And it did to a great extent.
One instance I remember when we opened the park, and we had all kinds of law enforcement people on the grounds there, and it was kind of tense, but I was sitting in my office and I got a call from your Red Cross, and he said, you know what's happened over the park? And I said, no, and he said they've got CBS and other national people are covering the deal over there, and the chief of police won't let them in the park. So I got on radio. I didn't want to embarrass the chief by blasting out on the radio, but I called and said, make a phone call to me and say, hey, open the gates and let's get in. So everything went all right after that.
You may have noticed in our look back at the formative years of the civil rights movement in Macon that there wasn't much violence to show you, except for those rocks tossed in Tatthall Square Park. That's because there was very little. And it wasn't just an accident that Macon escaped the violence, fighting, and rioting that plagued other cities. It's because men like E.B. Pascal, Van Malone, Jim Wood, Bill Randall, Ed Wilson, and many others were determined that the social changes which were inevitable would come to Macon without that violence.
I like to get on the bus and sit where I please. And I don't please to sit in the back either. But we are determined to be free in every way. Free at the hospital. Free and equal in the schools. Free to take any job that I'm qualified for.